Part 1, 3:17 in the morning, the 29th of November 1944, 100 miles south of Yokosuka Naval Base, Japan. Commander Joseph Enright, 34 years old, from Minot, North Dakota, stood at the periscope of the United States submarine Archerfish. He had been at that periscope for the last 6 hours. In the reticle of the periscope was a Japanese warship. The ship was so large that Enright at first thought he was looking at a fleet. He was not looking at a fleet, he was looking at one ship. Behind him on the bridge, his executive officer, Lieutenant William Andrews, said the sentence he would repeat for the rest of his life. He said, "Captain, we have never seen anything like her." Enright watched the target through the periscope for 30 more seconds. Then he said 2 words. He said, "Fire 1." 6 torpedoes left the forward tubes of the Archerfish in the next 28 seconds. 4 of them hit the largest warship the Imperial Japanese Navy ever built. She was called Shinano. She was the 3rd ship of the Yamato-class of battleships, converted, in the middle of construction, into an aircraft carrier. She was 71,890 tons. She was the largest aircraft carrier in the world. The record would stand for the next 17 years until the American nuclear carrier USS Enterprise entered service in 1961. She had been at sea for 10 hours and 30 minutes. She was still 10 hours and 30 minutes from being finished. Her watertight bulkheads had never been pressure tested. Her damage control crews had never been trained. 40% of her sailors had come aboard in the previous 30 days. She had 300 civilian shipyard workers still aboard, still installing pipes and cables in her lower decks. She had never fought a battle. She had never operated an aircraft. She had never even loaded ammunition. And in 7 hours and 40 minutes, she would roll over in 4,000 meters of water and take 1,435 men to the bottom of the Pacific. This is the story of the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. It is a record that has stood unbroken for 80 years. It is not likely to be broken, but before we come back to those 7 hours and before we come back to those 4 torpedoes, you have to understand 3 things. You have to understand the ship. You have to understand the man who commanded her. And you have to understand the man who was ordered on that same night to shoot her. Let us start with the ship. Her name was Shinano. She had been laid down on the 4th of May, 1940, at the naval arsenal in Yokosuka, Japan. Yokosuka is a coastal city 50 miles southwest of Tokyo. The naval arsenal there had been building warships for the Imperial Japanese Navy since 1869. Shinano was originally intended to be the 3rd battleship of the Yamato-class. The Yamato-class was the largest battleship design ever built. Yamato, the first of her class, was 72,000 tons. She carried 9 18-inch guns. Musashi, the second of her class, was identical. Shinano, hull number 110, would have been the 3rd. She was 50% complete on the 4th of June, 1942. That was the day of the Battle of Midway. That was the day the Imperial Japanese Navy lost 4 of its 6 fleet aircraft carriers in a single afternoon. Within 3 months of Midway, the Naval General Staff in Tokyo convened an emergency conference. The men in that room, including Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, the chief of the Operations Bureau, understood what Midway had done to the naval balance into the Pacific. Japan could not win a naval war with battleships. She had to have carriers. She had lost 4 in one day. She had 2 Yamato-class battleships already at sea and a 3rd half-built at Yokosuka. The conference reached a decision. Hull number 110 would not become a battleship. She would be converted in the middle of her construction into the largest aircraft carrier ever built. The conversion order was signed on the 30th of September 1942. Yokosuka Naval Arsenal cut off the upper decks of the half-built battleship hull. They rebuilt the internal spaces to accommodate aviation fuel tanks. They installed a hangar deck. They installed a flight deck 300 meters long, armored with 95 millimeters of steel plate, thicker than the flight deck of any aircraft carrier that had ever gone to sea. They gave her a name, Shinano, named after Shinano Province, the mountainous heartland of central Japan. It was the province where several of Japan's oldest emperors had been born. The conversion was supposed to take 24 months. It took 39. By the summer of 1944, the war had turned against Japan. American submarines were sinking Japanese merchant ships at a rate Japan could not replace. American aircraft carriers were operating within striking distance of the Japanese home islands. American B-29 bombers, based in the newly captured Mariana Islands, were beginning to hit Tokyo. Yokosuka was 50 miles from Tokyo. If the Americans hit Yokosuka, the dry dock holding Shinano would be destroyed, and Japan's largest warship would burn in place. The commander of the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, Rear Admiral Yasuji Watanabe, argued to the Naval General Staff that Shinano had to be moved. She could not stay in the dry dock. She had to be sailed south to the naval base at Kure on the inland sea, Scots 350 miles away. Kure was more defensible. Kure had the machinery to finish her. The Naval General Staff agreed. The problem was that Shinano was not finished. On the 19th of November, 1944, at the ceremonial commissioning at Yokosuka, Shinano was officially inducted into the Imperial Japanese Navy. She was approximately 50% complete. The watertight bulkheads, dividing her hull into more than 1,200 compartments, had never been pressure tested. Under standard naval construction practice, every watertight compartment in a warship is tested with water at pressure to verify that its doors will hold. Yamato and Musashi had gone through this testing over a period of 6 months. Shinano's testing had not begun. The fire mains in her lower decks were incomplete. Some of them leaked, others had never been connected to the ship's pumps. The damage control drills that a warship's crew is supposed to practice for a year before combat had not happened. Shinano's damage control officers had been aboard for less than 3 months. 40% of her sailors had come aboard in the previous 30 days. They did not know their compartments. They did not know the ship's ventilation layout. They did not know where the counterfluiding controls were located. Some of them had never been to sea before, and 300 civilian workers from the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal were still aboard, still installing pipes and cables and electrical systems on the lowered deck. She was 50% complete. She had a captain who was aware of every single one of these problems. His name was Toshio Abe. He was 55 years old on the day of Shinano's departure. He had been born in December of 1889 on the northern Japanese island of Hokkaido. He had graduated from the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy at Etajima in the class of 1911. That was the same academy that had produced Yamamoto and Nagumo, though Abe had graduated after them and had never risen to their rank. He was a torpedo officer. He was not an aviator. He had spent his career on destroyers. He had commanded the destroyer Shirakumo in the Aleutian Islands campaign of 1943. He had been at the Battle of Midway in May of that year on the deck of his destroyer, watching the American fleet close on a Japanese garrison that would not be reinforced and could not be evacuated. Every soldier on Midway died. Abe watched. He had been promoted to captain in October of 1943. In July of 1944, he had been given the command of Shinano. It was an unusual assignment. Aircraft carriers in the Imperial Japanese Navy were traditionally commanded by aviators or by officers with experience in air operations. Abe had neither. He knew this. He had accepted the assignment anyway. He had spent the last 4 months at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, walking Shinano's decks, meeting his officers, meeting his crew, and reading damage reports of Japanese warships that had been sunk in the previous 2 years. He had read the reports on Musashi, sunk at Leyte Gulf a month earlier by American aircraft. He had read the reports on the light carriers Zuiho and Shitoshi, sunk at Cape Ingano the same week. He had read the reports on the battleship Fuso, sunk at Surigao Strait. He had understood Japan was losing every capital ship she sent to sea. Shinano was the last major fleet unit she had built. If Shinano was lost, there would be no more. He had one job: get Shinano to Kuri, and there was a third man in this story. His name was Joseph Francis Enright. He was 34 years old on the night he shot Shinano. He had been born on the 18th of September, 1910, in Mino, North Dakota. His father was a railroad conductor. His mother was a schoolteacher. He was the second of 5 children. He had entered the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis in 1929 and graduated in the class of 1933. He had spent the second half of the 1930s learning submarines. In the summer of 1944, he had been in command of the submarine USS Dace in the Western Pacific when he had sighted a Japanese fleet aircraft carrier called Shokaku. Shokaku was one of the 2 carriers that had launched aircraft at Pearl Harbor. She was one of the most experienced ships in the Japanese Navy. Enright had lined up a torpedo shot. He had fired. He had missed. Shokaku had gone on to fight in the Battle of the Philippine Sea and to be sunk by another American submarine 2 weeks later. Enright had not been the one to sink her. Well, he had returned to Pearl Harbor from that patrol convinced that he had failed. He had gone to his squadron commander and had requested to be relieved of command. He had said, in essence, that he did not think he was fit to command a submarine in wartime. His squadron commander had granted the request. Enright had spent the fall of 1944 in Pearl Harbor in a shore assignment teaching submarine tactics to new officers. Then in October of 1944, the submarine force had needed a commanding officer for the USS Archerfish. Her previous captain was rotating home. Enright's shore duty was up. His squadron commander asked him if he wanted the boat. He said yes. The Archerfish sailed from Pearl Harbor on the 30th of October 1944 on her 5th war patrol. Her assignment was not to hunt Japanese warships. Her assignment was lifeguard duty. She was to patrol off the coast of Japan in the sea approaches to Tokyo and rescue American B-29 crews shot down during the strategic bombing offensive. Enright had asked for one specific patrol area. He had asked to be positioned in the sea lanes east of Tokyo Bay. He had been given it. On the evening of the 28th of November, 1944, he was there. At 6 in the evening, the light was gone. Shinano's engines came alive. 4 boilers, 150,000 horsepower, driving 4 propellers larger than a 2-story house. She cast off from the pier at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal. Her 3 escort destroyers, Isakaze, Yukikaze, and Hamakaze, formed up around her. The escort commander was Captain Kenzo Shibuya aboard Isakaze. Yukikaze was the famous Lucky destroyer of the Imperial Japanese Navy. She had fought at Guadalcanal, at Midway, at Truk, at the Marianas, at Leyte. She had never been hit by a torpedo or a bomb. Her crew believed she could not be sunk. They were right. Yukikaze would survive the war. The 3 destroyers and the largest aircraft carrier in the world moved out of Tokyo Bay in a black November night. Captain Toshio Abe stood on the bridge of Shinano. He had one advantage over any American submarine that might be waiting for him. Shinano's top speed was 28 knots. No American submarine in the Pacific could match that speed submerged. If Abe steamed a straight course south at flank speed, he would be at Kuri by dawn. He did not order a straight course, he ordered a zigzag. Standard anti-submarine doctrine. The zigzag reduced his effective speed of advance from 28 knots to 20 knots. 20 knots, a surface American submarine could match him. 28 knots, one could not. He did not know that. He was following the book. At 8:48 in the evening on the 28th of November, 120 miles south of Yokosuka, the radar operator on the USS Archerfish reported a large surface contact. Commander Joseph Enright climbed to the bridge. He looked at the surface of the Pacific. He looked at the contact on the radar. He gave one order. Battle stations. The largest sinking in the history of submarine warfare was about to begin. He had 6 hours to catch her. He had 4 minutes at the periscope to shoot her. He had 34 years of life behind him and 45 years of life ahead of him, and only one of them was going to matter historically, and it was not the years yet to come. Porp 2:20:48 in the evening, the 28th of November, 1944. The radar operator on the USS Archerfish looked at the plot and said one sentence. He said, "Captain, the target is big." Commander Joseph Enright looked at the return. The return was the size of the returns he had seen off Japanese battleships in his previous patrol on the USS Stace, but it was bigger than that. It was the largest surface radar return anyone on the Archerfish had ever seen. Enright made a rapid calculation. The contact was 12 miles north of him. It was moving south on a mean course of about 190. It was making about 20 knots. If he stayed on the surface and pushed his diesels to maximum, he could make 19 knots. So he was slower than his target by 1 knot over enough time. That meant she would leave him behind. But she was zigzagging. He could see it in the radar plot. Every 8 to 10 minutes, she was making a course change of approximately 30 degrees. Left, right, left, right. The zigzag reduced her mean speed of advance from 28 knots to 20. If she zigzagged into his position, he would have to be patient. He would have to hold his course. He ordered his diesels to flank. 19 knots following on the surface at night in seas, heavy enough to break over the bridge every few minutes and soak him and the 2 lookouts and the executive officer in cold salt water. He did not know what she was. He knew only that she was large. He radioed Pearl Harbor. He requested any known Japanese ship movement in the area. Pearl Harbor answered. Pearl Harbor said no known movement. Enright kept the boat on the surface. Pearl Harbor had not seen this ship because this ship had never been seen. Shinano had spent her entire construction and her entire fitting out in the dry docks of Yokosuka Naval Arsenal. She had never been photographed by American reconnaissance aircraft. American naval intelligence did not know she existed. Enright chased her for the next 6 hours. He watched her zigzag through the plots. He watched her get away from him for periods, then come back. He watched 3 destroyers on his radar, one ahead, one on her port side, one on her starboard side, forming an anti-submarine screen around a target that was clearly high value. He calculated her course. He calculated her turn patterns. At approximately 0300 on the 29th of November, he realized something. Her next zigzag would bring her directly onto his position. He submerged. He came to periscope depth. He waited. She came into his periscope at 3:15. The moon was out. The seas were calm. He could see the target clearly at 1,400 yards, silhouetted against the eastern horizon. He looked at the flight deck. He looked at the island sputer structure amidships. He looked at the escorts arranged around her. He said on the record later that his first thought was that he was looking at a fleet. He was looking at one ship. Her flight deck was 300 meters long. Her displacement was over 70,000 tons. She was larger than any aircraft carrier the American Navy had ever built to that point in the war. She was larger than the Essex-class fleet carriers, the Yorktown, and the Enterprise. She was larger than the escort carriers and the light carriers combined. Enright did not know what she was called. He did not know she was the largest warship ever built by the Imperial Japanese Navy. He did not know that the record he was about to set would stand unbroken for 80 years. He knew only what he saw. He turned to his executive officer, Lieutenant William Andrews. He said, "Andy, we have never seen anything like her." Andrews looked into the periscope. He said, "No, sir, we have not." Enright ordered the boat to attack posture, bow tubes flooded, outer doors open, depth set at 10 feet, running just under the surface, warheads armed, 6 torpedoes ready. At 3:17 in the morning, on the 29th of November, 1944, Joseph Enright fired the 6 torpedoes. They left the tubes in an interval of 28 seconds. They ran at 46 knots. They covered 1,400 yards in approximately 55 seconds. The first torpedo hit Shinano's starboard side at a frame later identified in Japanese damage reports as frame 52. Punched through the outer hull, it exploded inside a machinery space. The second torpedo hit 16 seconds after the first at frame 67. It exploded inside the forward engine room. The third torpedo hit at frame 98, approximately amidships, in the compartment that would have held aviation gasoline if Shinano had been carrying aviation gasoline. She was not. The tanks were empty. There was no fireball, the compartment simply filled with water. The fourth torpedo hit at frame 124, forward of the amidships island, in the space that would have held the forward magazine if the forward magazine had been loaded. It had not been loaded. Shinano had never taken on ammunition. 2 torpedoes missed, ran under her keel, kept going into the dark. 4 hits on the starboard side, spread across approximately 80 meters of hull length, all below the waterline. Yamato, Shinano's older sister, had taken 10 torpedoes and 7 bombs before she sank at Tengo operation 5 months later. Musashi, Shinano's other sister, had taken 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs at Leyte Gulf a month earlier. Shinano would take 4 torpedoes. She would still sink, because none of her watertight bulkheads had ever been pressure tested. The 4 torpedo explosions ruptured Shinano's outer hull in 4 places. Water began pouring into the ship at a rate her pumps could not match. At 3:18, the damage control officer, Lieutenant Commander Aramaki, ordered all watertight doors below the 3rd deck closed. The crews at those doors closed them. Most of them did not seal. The seals were dry. They had never been tested. Under water pressure at combat conditions, they leaked. Some leaked slowly, some leaked in torrents. Water that should have been contained in the outer compartments flowed inward, 1 compartment at a time, filling spaces the design had promised would stay dry. Within 20 minutes, Shinano had a list of 8 degrees to starboard. The damage control team began counter-fluting on the port side, standard procedure, flood empty compartments on the opposite side of the ship to level her out. The counter-fluting pumps did not work at full capacity. The pumps had never been fully rigged. They pumped water at maybe 40% of their design flow. The list increased. By 4:30 in the morning, the list was 15 degrees. By 6 in the morning, the list was 20 degrees. 20 degrees of list, an aircraft carrier cannot recover aircraft. Not that Shinano had any aircraft to recover. She had never operated one. 20 degrees of list, an aircraft carrier cannot operate her steam turbines at full power. The lubricating oil in the reduction gear will not stay in place. Shinano lost power at approximately 7:30 in the morning. The engineering crews below decks fought fires and floods in the dark. Some of them died in the dark. Their names appear in the Japanese naval records, but their bodies were never recovered. Captain Toshio Abe stood on the bridge of his ship. He looked at the list. He looked at the damage reports coming up from below. He looked at the 3 destroyers screening him and at the empty horizon east of him where dawn was breaking. He gave the order to alter course toward the coast. He tried to beach her. She could not make the coast. She was down too far. At 8 in the morning on the 29th of November, Captain Abe ordered the flag transferred to the destroyer Hamikazes. His staff went aboard Hamikaz, signal officers, communications officers, junior lieutenants. He did not go with them. At 9 in the morning, the Emperor's portrait was ceremonially removed from Shinano's bridge and taken aboard Yukikaze. The portrait was the physical representation of the Emperor's authority. It was tradition that it left the ship before the ship went down. At 10:18 in the morning, Captain Abe ordered the crew to abandon ship. The crew jumped 1,500 men in the water, 300 civilian workers in the water. The 3 destroyers began fishing men out. According to the account left by Lieutenant Commander Aramaki, the damage control officer, who was one of the survivors, Captain Abe was on the bridge as the ship rolled. Aramaki went to him. He said, "Sir, you must come down." Abe did not answer. Aramaki said later that Abe was tied to a bridge stanchion. He said his executive officer had tied him. He said Abe had ordered his executive officer to tie him. He said Abe would not have left the ship even without the rope. The rope was for the officers who would have refused to leave otherwise. At 10:57 on the morning of the 29th of November, 1944, 17 hours after she had left the pier at Yokosuka, Shinano rolled over onto her starboard side and sank. She went down in 4,000 meters of water. She took Captain Toshio Abe with her. She took approximately 1,100 of her crew with her. She took approximately 300 civilian shipyard workers with her. 1,435 men in total, 200 kilometers southeast of the Keiki Peninsula of Japan. The largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. The record still stands. At the moment Shinano went under, USS Archerfish was 75 miles east, on the surface, running on diesels for the first shift of the day. Enright had not seen her sink. He had not known she had sunk. He had made a single evasion dive at 4:30 in the morning when a Japanese destroyer pinged him briefly with sonar, and then he had come back to the surface and set a course east, away from the target area, to send his contact report and to reload torpedoes. He radioed Pearl Harbor at approximately noon. He reported firing 6 torpedoes at a large Japanese aircraft carrier. He estimated 4 hits. He estimated the target had sunk. Pearl Harbor answered him. Pearl Harbor said, "You did not sink an aircraft carrier. There was no Japanese aircraft carrier in that area." Pearl Harbor said, "You sunk something smaller, a converted cruiser, maybe an escort carrier at most." Enright did not argue. He submitted his patrol report. His patrol report was reviewed by the Bureau of Naval Intelligence in Washington. Intelligence found no correlation with any known Japanese ship movement. The kill was downgraded to a probable cruiser. Enright kept fighting the war. He returned to Pearl Harbor at the end of the patrol. He was told that his claim of an aircraft carrier was not accepted. He was awarded the Navy Cross for the patrol, but the citation described the target as an escort carrier. He did not push it. The war continued for another 9 months. Then the war ended. Then Japanese naval records began to be translated. Then the truth came out. In the summer of 1946, a Japanese naval officer named Aramaki testified to an American occupation intelligence team about the sinking of a ship called Shinano. The Americans took the testimony down. They filed it. They did not immediately understand what they had. Over the next several years, other Japanese naval records surfaced. The construction records of Shinano were located at Yokosuka. The action reports of the destroyers Isakaze, Yukikaze, and Hamikaze were located at the Naval General Staff Archive in Tokyo. The damage reports were compiled, the picture assembled slow. The Japanese had built an aircraft carrier that no American intelligence report of the war had ever named. She had displaced 71,890 tons at full load. She had been longer, heavier, and more heavily armored than any American aircraft carrier of the Second World War. She had been 3 days into her working up phase when she had sailed from Yokosuka on the 28th of November, 1944. She had been sunk that same night by the USS Archerfish, by Commander Joseph Enright. The Bureau of Naval Personnel reviewed the case in 1952. They looked at Enright's original patrol report from December of 1944. They looked at the Japanese records. They matched them. The kill was reclassified. In 1953, 9 years after the event, the United States Navy officially credited Commander Joseph Enright with the sinking of the Imperial Japanese Navy aircraft carrier Shinano. He was awarded his second Navy Cross for the action. He was the only United States Navy submarine commander of the Second World War to sink an Imperial Japanese Navy fleet aircraft carrier as the sole attacker. He had done it on his second command, 4 months after he had turned in his first command because he believed he was not fit to hold it. Joseph Enright continued to serve in the Navy after the war. He commanded shore installations, he served on staff assignments. He retired with the rank of captain on the 1st of October, 1963. He was 53 years old. He moved to Fairfax, Virginia. He raised a family. He kept a photograph of the USS Archerfish on the wall of his study. In 1976, 32 years after the sinking, he published a book. The book was called Shinano, The Sinking of Japan's Secret Supership. It was based on his own patrol records, on the declassified Japanese naval documents from Yokosuka and Tokyo, on interviews he had conducted in Japan with survivors of Shinano, and on the personal recollections of Lieutenant Commander Aramaki, the damage control officer who had watched Captain Abe refuse to leave the bridge. Enright and Aramaki had met for the first time in Tokyo in 1978, 2 years after the book came out. Aramaki was in his 70s, Enright was 68. They met in a hotel room in central Tokyo over coffee with a Japanese interpreter present. Aramaki brought Japanese naval records. He brought the compartment failure diagrams. He brought the deck logs of the destroyer Isakaze. He brought a photograph of Captain Abe from before the war. Enright brought a photograph of the USS Archerfish. They talked for 3 hours. They did not talk about strategy. They did not talk about who had been right and who had been wrong. They talked about the ship. They talked about the men who had died on it. Aramaki, at the end of the meeting, said one sentence. He said, "We are both old men now. The war is far away." Enright wrote about the meeting in an epilogue to the second edition of his book. He wrote, quote, "When I sank Shinano, I did not know how many men were aboard her. I know now." Aramaki lived until the late 1980s. His memoir of the sinking was published in Japanese in 1952 and has never been translated into English in full. Excerpts from it appear in Enright's book. Joseph Enright died on the 20th of July 2000. He was 89 years old. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Captain Toshio Abe never came out of Shinano. His body was not recovered. He was promoted posthumously to the rank of Rear Admiral in the Imperial Japanese Navy in December of 1944. The promotion was not made public in Japan. The loss of Shinano was classified as a secret by the Naval General Staff. The Japanese public was not told that Shinano had ever existed until after the war. Abe's family was informed that he had died in the service of the Empress. They were not told how. His widow received the small survivor's pension provided to families of naval officers killed in action. She lived on it quietly, in a small house, in a small town in central Japan, until her death in the 1970s. A memorial marker was placed at the Etajima Naval Academy, where Abe had graduated in 1911. The marker lists his name, it does not list his ship. Rear Admirals Yasuji Watanabe, the commander of the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, who had ordered Shinano's premature departure, survived the war. He was disciplined by the Naval General Staff in December of 1944. He was transferred to a shore assignment for the remainder of the war. He was not tried at any post-war tribunal. He lived until 1961. In 1956, 12 years after the sinking, he wrote a private memoir. The memoir was never widely published, but a copy exists in the archive of the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force at Etajima. In the memoir, Watanabe wrote a sentence that has been quoted in Japanese naval history ever since. He wrote, quote, "We murdered 1,435 men because it could not wait 30 more days for completion. The USS Archerfish, the boat that sank Shinano, served through the end of the war and was decommissioned in 1955. The Navy has commissioned 2 other submarines named Archerfish since then. The most recent USS Archerfish, hull number SSN 678, was a Sturgeon-class nuclear submarine that served from 1971 to 1998. No United States warship has ever been named Shinano. The wreck of Shinano has never been found. She lies at approximately 32 degrees north, 137 degrees east at a depth of approximately 4,000 meters. That is about 13,000 feet below the surface of the Pacific. It is a depth beyond the reach of most modern submersibles. The battleship Yamato, Shinano's older sister, was located in 1985 by a Japanese search team using a manned deep submersible. Yamato lies at 340 meters. Photographs were taken. The wreck is documented. The battleship Musashi, Shinano's other sister, was located in March of 2015 by the private research vessel Octopus, funded by Paul Allen. Musashi lies at 1,000 meters. Photographs were taken. The wreck is documented. Shinano has not been located. The Japanese government has not sponsored a search. Private expeditions have not tried. The reason, according to the Japanese naval historian Akihiko Yoshida, is that there is not much appetite in Japan for finding her. She was Japan's greatest warship. She was rushed to sea. She was killed by 4 American torpedoes and by 50% completion. She killed 1,435 men who did not need to die that night. Some of those men were sailors. 300 of them were civilian construction workers who had come aboard to keep installing pipe. They had families in Yokosuka and Yokohama and small towns further inland, wives, children, parents. Some of them received the small compensation the Japanese government paid after the war to families of civilians killed in the naval war. Some of them received nothing. Somewhere in Japan tonight, in the household of a family in a small town whose owners no longer remember exactly why the framed photograph on the wall of the sitting room shows a young man in a workman's jacket in the 1940s, is the name of a man who died in the lower decks of an aircraft carrier that had never fought a battle. He had never fired a gun. He had never flown an aircraft. He had gone to sea on his first voyage and gone down before dawn on his first morning. He was building a ship that was going to save his country. It did not save his country. It killed him. It killed 1,434 other men with him. And in a house in Fairfax, Virginia, in the summer of 2000, an 89-year-old man who had commanded the submarine that shot her sat in the study of his house with a photograph of the USS Archerfish on the wall behind him and a book called Shinano on the shelf beside him, and he thought about the man who had been tied to the bridge of a ship that could not be saved, and about the damage control officers who had ordered him tied, and about the destroyer Yukikaze that had picked survivors out of the water on the morning after, and about Aramaki, whom he had met for coffee in Tokyo in 1978. We are both old men now. The war is far away. Joseph Enright had turned in his first command in 1944 because he did not believe he was fit to hold it. He had received his second command 4 months later. He had used his second command to sink the largest warship the Imperial Japanese Navy ever built. The Japanese Naval General Staff had thought Shinano would save Japan. She could not have saved Japan. Nothing was going to save Japan by November of 1944. But she was going to try. She lasted 10 hours and 30 minutes. The record has stood for 80 years. Japan's greatest warship was never finished. She went to sea anyway. She did not come back. Somewhere off the coast of the Kii Peninsula, 4,000 meters down in the cold dark of the Pacific Ocean, she is still there. She is still going down. She is not coming up. And the men on all sides who fought that war, on ships that were finished and on ships that were not, on winning sides and on losing sides, are almost all gone now. We are both old men now. The war is far away. The ones who did not come home are the reason the rest of us did.